Good morning. This is Bernard Layton and Marion Carr at Comar Partners. Appreciate the opportunity to visit with everyone today, make an introduction of our firm, our practice area, and have a dialogue discussion around talent in the biotech market. Just wanted to introduce as Bernard Layton, 34 years in executive search and head up our firm, Comar Partners. We are 6 offices and a 30-person team around the country. A good portion of our business is in the healthcare and life sciences practice, where we'll spend our time today, and Marion heads up that practice. That industry and those segments are under considerable change and churn these days, and particularly we'll focus a little bit of our discussion today around the biotech market. So, Marion, give you an opportunity to make an introduction. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Thank you, Bernie. I'm Marion Spears-Carr. I'm the Managing Director for Healthcare and Life Sciences, as Bernie talked about. We're just glad to be with you, share with you a little bit about what we're doing, and connect with all of you afterwards. So thank you for this time.
Appreciate it. So we're in dynamic times caused by all the extraneous events that are going on in the world. The biotech market specifically is where we'll spend our time and address a little bit today. Our firm has extensive 25-year experience in doing work with venture-backed, publicly traded, large pharma, healthcare related life sciences companies. The biotech market is in dynamic evolution, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. The market drivers are considerable money being pushed into those markets, a more and more sophisticated product development, product evolution process is underway, a much more engaged and interested regulatory effort, and a much higher collaboration with FDA, NIH, with biotech, specific in some of the areas that are of concern today. And as a result, it's caused a substantial change in the market, the talent market, specifically our world and our expertise. And so we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. And so in a quick overview, and then we'll get into some specifics here. There's more than $4 billion annual being spent on venture-backed financing domestically alone in biotech startup, early stage startup, and mid-stage post-initial product launch. The challenges that are faced here is that there's just not enough talent with the specific capabilities to address the needs that are out there. And we'll talk a little bit about a couple of specific roles, and so some insights about the market, and some thoughts, Marion, about where you think this market's headed.
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot of different things that are happening in the marketplace that Bernie's already talked about, but one of the challenges that we have is that a lot of the organizations that we're talking about are trying to scale and grow dramatically to take advantage of the funding that they have. The problem with that is that they may not have the infrastructure to find the talent they need to do that. And one of the things that we're seeing is that we have to really work with the clients on identifying not only the talent they need, but really understanding what's going to have the biggest impact. And I think a lot of our clients are so involved in what they're trying to do that they're not necessarily dialing in on what specific talent they need to hire. And I think that's where we come into play.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think that at the core here is there is a cultural integration at the time that they're in hyper growth, at a time when there is very circumspect oversight by a money financing board. And so everyone has to work effectively together to build a culture, build an infrastructure, build the organization that we're talking about. And talent is the key element of this. And I find that the interesting challenge here is that you tend to have CEOs or leadership that have come forward with the proper concept, proper therapeutic idea, built it around some either licensed or proprietary research. And then they tend to be academicians or scientists and don't necessarily bring a general management skill set to running the businesses. Culture is imperative, and this is true of all industries, but particularly in the biotech world, there is a sense of urgency to bring products to market. There is a regulatory overlay that sits here as well. So, let's talk about that a little bit. My sense is that there are many key roles that need to get filled in this space, but particularly it's going to be, and we'll spend some time on this, but we find the key linchpin roles tend to be chief medical officers for these organizations, CFOs, and then potentially head of regulatory affairs are the big three that we see in terms of getting the infrastructure built, having the leadership profiles that we need. And so we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. Before we get there, though, just more thoughts on where we're headed in this practice and ultimately the imperatives that are there. What are the soft skills, hard skills? What are the issues that sit? And so as a CEO, potentially not ever having run a business before, any thoughts on what they should be focused on in terms of skill sets, stylings, the assessment issues, the soft skill assessment issues that are out there?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that we find is that, as you mentioned, a lot of the CEOs, they've started based on their intellectual property, based on their engagement, based on their passion about that particular thing that they're making, that product or that service or that whatever it might be. And one of the things that we need to look at when you think about building your team is do people have the shared vision? Are they excited about what you're doing? I mean, you could do a search for a chief scientific officer that has a lot of different skill sets, understands your particular product or your particular disease process or whatever problem you're trying to solve. But if they're not connected with you from a mission perspective and what you're trying to achieve, I think that's absolutely critical. I think the second piece is we have to really, as CEOs, need to really think about what do we see our company being in 5 years, 7 years, 10 years? Is it just a play to create something to sell, or are we really trying to make a difference? And if that's the case, then we need to talk about finding people, engaging people, connecting people that are also like-minded. So I think that's understanding what your culture is, being able to say, this is the culture of the organization I want to create, this is what we're trying to do, and this is the problem we're trying to solve in the marketplace, and this is who we're trying to serve. And I think if you look at that first, then that becomes a framework for who you want to hire after that.
Yeah, there's a bundling of this for those that maybe don't understand this fully is they call it employer value proposition. And what is the 20-second elevator pitch of why this company exists and why a key executive should join the company to help build out the organization? A lot of organizations get very caught up in this world in starting to process and bring the product to market and don't necessarily step back and think about the foundational pieces the way they should. The employer value proposition varies from organization to organization. Great example of are we a get the product to market, get post third level trial, get the product to market through regulatory process, get through all the clinical reporting, get the product to market and license it and basically be done and sell it? Or are we building something, as some of the biotechs have, where it becomes a multi-layered, sophisticated research and development, multi-product category, various different therapeutic area, substantial self-sustaining business, and various degrees right in between those two, right? That's kind of the full spectrum there. And so I think it evolves. It's not something you crystallize right from the start, but I think a CEO of an organization should be spending considerable time on this every week, evaluating who we are, where we're headed, under the mandate of capital financing, under the mandate of the therapeutic dynamics that are in the range that they're focused on. And ultimately, setting a tone, setting in a value proposition that they can then purport out to the market, purport out to the candidate pool, and attract good talent. That's the number one challenge we see in our world in doing this for many years, is do we have an effective, cohesive, aligned statement for purpose of business that can be communicated back to the talent pool, right? Yeah. Comments on that?
Oh, absolutely. I think particularly now with the talent competition, the competition for talent right now, because of all the money that we've already talked about that's coming in, all the different growth, all things that are happening, is competition for talent is going to be unbelievably tight. And because of that, unless we have, as a company, our client has a very compelling reason for somebody to come there, something that's driving them and understands what is that compelling value proposition, they're going to struggle, and particularly in competing with what's out there. There's leaders in this space have more opportunities right now to choose from than they've ever had in the last 15 years.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And in fact, our mandate or motto in talking to our clients is you need to assess, but you also have to attract. That the talent pool is so tight in key specific areas that ultimately there's a need to be strong at selling the candidates to join the organization, as well as attracting or as well as assessing their skills. Too many organizations, not to dwell here, but too many organizations think that they're so unique and special at what they do that at times they aren't applying enough energy to the attract side of that equation that people would be lucky to work here sort of mandate. And in this dynamic market, in the churn that's underway, and in the limited talent pool that's out there, a little humility will go a long way in creating attractive environment for future leaders in the organization. So I would pivot here a little bit and talk a little bit about some of the soft skills that are needed in leadership in a biotech company and where we're headed in terms of an evolution of leadership in the many years that we both have done this. There was very much a product driven, a skill set around pipeline building and executing and pushing products and therapeutic outcomes through a pipeline and through a discovery process. I think it's still very much there, but I think the ability to interact effectively with the venture money leadership, the board, to effectively deal with regulatory agencies, and that's a variety of them that apply, to understand how to interact with the research and the academic community in terms of understanding where the product offerings and product development and or research efforts are underway, and having a broad reach within the therapeutic area that they work in is critical for a variety of different jobs, from chief medical to chief science to head of research to head of regulatory, so on and so forth. And our experience has really been that there is a need for those soft skill development, soft skill understanding, and assessing those in equal portion to the specific knowledge that they have. Comments on that?
No, I think you're correct. I think one of the challenges that they're facing is we focus just on the science. We just focus on the technical skill set. We're not taking into account that the workforce is changing. The people they have to lead is changing. Michael McAbee wrote a book called The Leaders We Need, What Makes Us Follow, that says the next workforce, the one we're seeing now, are interactives. Are we working collaboratively? Are we gaining? And those skills, a lot of times people in the labs that are coming out of that they know how to collaborate with other scientists, but how do they collaborate with people that don't have that scientific background? So when you have leaders that can communicate on a much broader scale, a global scale, can understand different people's points of reference, has a strong EQ, emotional intelligence, that's a critical piece of the process.
Yeah, I totally concur, and ultimately the need here is it is focused on also interacting effectively peer-to-peer, so the leadership get along well and that there is a good collaboration, there is a good work dynamic, covering each other in the foxhole sort of mindset, reporting up and into effectively to the boards of these organizations, whether it's venture or public, and making sure that we've got an effective communication and awareness up to the board level to create reassurance and risk management and financial outcome to them. And then ultimately building a team, as you talked about, underneath. And we have interesting generational dynamics with 4, maybe 5 generations in the workforce right now. And how do you interact with those various groups and their needs in and away from work? And then I'll go put the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is, given our current times, what is the work environment? Is it remote? And how practical is that in a research-based company? How effective can you be in building contract workforce versus permanent, how much outsourcing, how much vendor management, all those sorts of things come into play in managing that culture and that environment and the skills needed. So I think we should, if appropriate here, move on to kind of addressing 3 or 4 key spots and talk a little bit about where we see some of the specific needs, and if good with that. So one that I'd like to dwell on, there's 3 or 4 that we'll spend a couple minutes on here, but the one I think that is sort of the linchpin in all of this is the chief medical officer or chief science officer, depending upon the organization and how they title it. It's a role that has to have deep technical knowledge, has to have very strong understanding of product development, product throughput, has to have great understanding of the clinical process and regulatory process, legal process, risk management, operational, but ultimately be the leader of effective spend to produce a product to yield an outcome that we're looking for. So any comments about that, and expand a little bit on some of the soft skill or skills that are needed for that particular role?
Yeah, I think there's kind of 2 things that really come to mind when you were talking about it. One of the things about the chief science officer, chief medical officer in today's environment is that fiduciary piece. Do they understand how to manage the money that they have to work with? Are they spending it in the right places? Are they using it appropriately? Because yes, there's a lot of money coming in, but there's also this expectation that there's going to be something out of that. So a lot of the people that have been in the science space don't necessarily have that entrepreneurial piece or manage the budget of those types. So that having that piece. I think the second piece, though, is to go back to what we were talking about in terms of soft skills, is being able to communicate effectively with people who are not from their background. And really getting the message across. So this is what we're trying to accomplish. Here's what we're trying to do. And I think when we find people like that have that technical piece, but also have an incredible command of communication, now we're making impact.
Yeah, and so it's a linchpin or critical role in the hub and spoke approach to how to build the biotech organization. They very much sit in that hub and managing that effectively. The challenges we see is they have to have good therapeutic range understanding within the specific purpose and agenda of that biotech. And so that deep technical knowledge with outreach into the academic world and into the research world is super critical. And yet they also have to have these broader skills, as we've talked about. So it makes it very, very challenging. Mm-hmm. We're seeing higher interview rates, meaning we can end up with 7 or 8 candidates being interviewed. And the pitfalls as we're seeing them is the ability for the leadership or the board to do enough to attract the individual. We're not talking about compensation, but we're talking about fostering the right environment, make sure there's alignment around delivery expectations, return on investment, pipeline and development management, and so on. And in many cases, their ability to then turn around and build and lead a team, we might call it the Pied Piper effect. So comments on that?
Yeah, no, I love the Pied Piper example. I also think about a sports example. People want to, let's look at Tom Brady. He goes to a team. People want to play with Tom Brady because he's the GOAT, right? He's the best. And if we can find that chief scientific officer that already has that social proof, people know that they're successful and know that they have that track record, they're drawn to work with people like that.
Yeah.
And I think that's a key piece.
Yeah, I think the challenge then, in addition to that, is creating the right dynamic with the board and their expectations out of the role, this fiduciary aspect, to dwell on it just a little bit further. And then an effective pairing with the CEO, the CFO, head of regulatory, head of operations, if it emerges to a pilot plant delivery approach or model for that biotech. So I think it's a key role. We're seeing exponential growth in that role. The soft skills we've talked about a little bit. There are some competencies that are needed here in terms of delivering a pipeline of products, evaluating return on investment, understanding the team building aspect of it, being current and insightful about the current research and or product offerings in the competitive landscape and or research world, and then ultimately have the ability in a historical proven track record of bringing the product all the way through clinical trials into production, into ultimately some either product capable company or a sell, and we see both. So these individuals have to have that proven track record, right? I think the next thing I would suggest we talk about is the chief financial officer role, right? Mm-hmm. That's going to be another one of these key roles. It is a functional leadership role. Mm-hmm. The elements of understanding a venture-backed or startup environment are pretty critical here. Their deep knowledge of the therapeutic area is probably less critical, but their understanding of how to bring products through to market and understanding the staging and gate management of the product development process, pricing, costs associated with that, and then, of course, reporting back to money sources and boards to make sure it's understood. Talk a little bit about some of the skills there, soft skills, hard competencies, the things that you see there.
Well, you hit on a couple, but one of the really key is that being able to communicate back to the funding arms, be it the private equity, be it wherever the money's coming from, and making sure that that organization has confidence in the financials of that organization and has a confidence in that CFO. Because let's face it, if they get a little concerned, particularly with all the different options for investing right now, that might be, well, we need to move along. So having that, being able to communicate where we are, understanding the financials, making sure that the private equity or whoever the funding arm is completely understanding where they are. I think that's one. I think second piece, though, is just thinking outside of just that current state, understanding what they need to do to scale. Because let's face it, all these companies ultimately are trying to create something that's going to scale. And it's one thing to have a real strong, competent, technical accounting leader as a CFO, but when we're talking about scaling the company and growing the company, then that's a completely different skill set.
Yeah, and the ultimate challenge here is keeping the board happy with it, to go back to your point around, are we getting the right investment? Are we managing our money effectively to get the outcome we need to? And in many cases now we're into third, fourth, fifth, sixth, 7 rounds of financing, and then maybe other strategic relationships, and the CFO in many cases is acting not only as that internal financial leader, but they're also acting as a outside relationship manager with the money, with the invested capital, with the licensing relationships with other organizations in the pharmaceutical world, all the way through to participating in evaluating next round of financing and business structure even. So they have a broad role to play in managing how the business will survive and then thrive as it develops and goes there. I think, ultimately the other roles that come up that are very, very critical, which speaks to our background, is senior leader in clinical management, getting through the clinical research process, very exhaustive elements to bringing that off. Also speaking a little bit to the head of or leader in the regulatory affairs and understanding how to get approval through to the market. And then ultimately operational leadership, depending upon whether the company is going to self-produce, contract produce, ultimately bring physical product to be used for the clinical process and through to product launch. So we can probably bunch these together a little bit at sort of the level down roles, but talk a little bit about our experiences there and or what you think are some of the key elements that leadership should be focused on.
Well, one of the things from an experience perspective, we have the capability of researching who in the marketplace has done what they want to do. And that's one of the ways we target who we're looking for that. If it's supply chain expansion, or if it's in the regulatory space, what are they trying to do? If it's through NIH or whoever they might be using, we have the ability to go out and find people that have done what they wanted to do and recruit those people. And I think thinking about that, I think the other thing, though, that really kind of sets us apart in that regard is we pay attention to what everybody else is doing, right? We understand the market, understand. I'm not sure I'm answering the question directly, but I think it's this idea of, if you look at all those key pieces, those are the pieces that are going to get this product to the market, however they're going to do it. And I think that's one of the things that we focus on as a firm.
Yeah. So I think ultimately that insights area, which is where you're focusing, is what differentiates all forms of consultants into the biotech business. We in the talent leadership area spend a considerable amount of time with dedicated analysts in our firm looking at trends, directions in the biotech space, whether it is current challenges in getting a pilot plant built, for example, which is kind of a unique because of all the supply chain challenges that are going on. Building and developing that pilot plant is a real bottleneck right now that's going on. Regulatory, there's a flood of products going to market, and as a result, the regulatory world is very constrained. It's bottlenecked, and there is a need to have the relationships with the research community, the academic community, with the regulatory agencies to get the products through, rise above through publishing and other approaches to make sure that rises to the top and gets special attention. And then ultimately on the clinical management side, it's extremely challenging. There is there's a general caution around participating in clinical trials right now because of fomenting of misinformation and other things that go on, as well as just sort of properly managing this where there are more and more products coming out and they're competing for a smaller and smaller talent pool. As all these therapeutic ranges get tighter and tighter and tighter, it's making it very interesting for the clinical leadership to figure out how to get it to market. And in many cases in that situation, it's the clinical third-party research organization that is supporting that makes it very, very challenging. And they're all busy and getting them to pay attention. So lots going on there. We're kind of wrapping up. Some final comments or thoughts on this discussion?
Oh, absolutely. I think the biggest thing that I want to get across, and I think we talk about it a lot, is regardless of the role that you're trying to fill, be it the ones we just talked about, that CFO, that Chief Scientific Officer, the CEO of the organization, whatever the role is, there's really one thing that really needs to come to the fore is now in this market, you have to move quickly. If you see the person that is the right fit, after you've gone through your efforts, you can't wait because there's so many opportunities. We're seeing clients miss out on amazing candidates because they didn't move fast enough.
Yeah.
And I think that if the one thing that comes out of this conversation is every organization out there that's wanting to grow, that needs one of these roles or is looking to expand, they need to be intentional and they need to move quickly when they find the right person. And that's why partnering is so important.
Yeah, I fully support that. The challenge we're facing is they're facing multiple offers at the same time. Exactly. There's a lot of competitive dynamics. We think that a well-organized executive search firm with good insights, deep knowledge of talent, deep knowledge of the various therapeutic ranges, deep knowledge of these key roles, and the assessment capability between us, probably 10,000 people assessed or talked to in the biotech world. It's important that that's properly selected. Welcome an opportunity, obviously, to be of support where that's appropriate. But I think a very good discussion and appreciate it today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And there'll be many more to come.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.